2 episodes ago, we took a look at some theories as what ghosts may be. The general idea was that the spirit of people who had an unnatural or violent and sudden end turns into ghosts, sometimes even evil if their resentment should be intense. As usual, I can't argue for or against that claim, but for today I collected stories that seem to be corresponding to the idea. Ghostly apparitions of the people with a tragic history. So, here are 4 allegedly true stories from Korea about resentful ghosts. As always, handpicked, translated and narrated by a host, Anthony. I'm a 33-year-old man and should like to think I'm all around healthy and normal, both mind and body. The story goes back to when I was 17. I was a bit of a troublemaker. I was cocky for my sturdy build and was often involved in fights. Anyway, one early winter, I visited a friend in Hansan in Chungcheong province. The friend suggested to come over to a hidden spot in a nearby mountain that his mates were already roasting chestnuts and having a drink there, away from the prying eyes of village adults. I had no reason to say no to drinks, so I gladly followed him. About 10 minutes into the mountain, and I could see a white smoke billowing up. There were 5 guys. Though from different school, I knew some of them already, so I could quickly mingle in. I happened to look around and noticed the plot we were in was indeed a bit odd. It seemed unexpectedly collapsed down, forming a small basin of a plot. Surrounded by higher ground, the feeble winter sunlight didn't even reach there. My friend confirmed that the plot kept dark all day and all year round, and an ideal spot for all sorts of naughty activities. But I found it tiny bit creepy there. Time was passing 5 in the afternoon, and we were finishing the second bottle between us. From the dark depth of the forest was heard a scream of a woman. We all heard it and looked around at each other. A few minutes later, a middle-aged woman appeared and called for us in desperate voice. "Help! Help! I need a hand, young man!" We asked what was up, and she said the rice field was flooded and its bank was about to collapse. "Won't you help me, please?" she said once again in a begging tone. We might have been delinquents, but all country village boys and sons of farmers, so we all 3 agreed and followed her. Strange thing was, the woman walked 20-30 meters ahead of us, and we could never catch her up. I started thinking it odd when one of the gang shouted, "Hey, that's a ghost! We are lured by a ghost!" Seeing others confused, he continued, "Look at her feet, you dumbass!" My heart dropped to find her feet levitating over the ground. But before we could react, the woman turned around to face us. Her face looked normal, except for the tongue that hung all the way down to her neck, and the sad, sad eyes, which I still can't forget. We finally turned and started running, but our body froze with such a shock that we all struggled. By the time we got back to my friend's place, we were a pathetic mess of sweat and dirt. Seeing us in the state, friend's father asked what was up. His face changed color and scolded us that whatever for we were in that part of the mountain, but didn't say anything more. We thought he wasn't believing us and insisted it was really a ghost that we saw. Only then he told us the story from 3 years prior. To start with, the plot we had drink party used to be, back in the days, a mass burial ground of babies and kids died of plagues. For the reputation, there was but one cottage in the surrounding where a widow lived with her aging mother-in-law. The old lady was unwell, and to pay all the medical bills, the widow worked hard to weave linen fabric. Hansan area is famous for its linen production. One day she was away to sell her linen in the market, and meanwhile, her cottage was struck by landslide with her old mother-in-law still in it. There was nothing much the poor widow could do by herself facing a home underground. But then unusually heavy downpour was claiming loss and damage in the whole area, and the help and rescue didn't reach this remote corner in time. Desperate widow decided to dig up to find her mother-in-law by herself, and got buried under the collapsing ground herself. Nobody knew what tragedy was taking place in that remote part of the village for 2 months, until 2 women's bodies were found by the rescue workers. Since then, it was rumored that people saw the dead widow wandering around the village in late autumn. Died with so much pain and resentment, she was said to lure her victims to death. Shamans were called in a few times to appease to the resentful soul, but they all gave up and ran away. In the end, the villagers blocked the way to where her old cottage used to be. No wonder that hole of hiding spot was so quiet. I don't know if what happened afterwards have anything to do with a resentful ghost, but in short span of time afterwards, one of the 7 who were present that day died of a car accident. I myself too barely survived a motorbike crash, while 2 others are in prison for killing people. I grew up in a small countryside village. In the whole village was a single corner shop, but even that would close down during the peak farming season. That left no other option but ride bicycle 20 minutes into town if I wanted a bag of snack or sweets. This happened one day in my 10th winter. My parents were hardly ever home before late evening, and my grandparents, who took care of me and my 4-year younger brother day to day, were also out that day. So in that big old farmhouse were just me and my brother. Dusk set in, and the small village with no street lamps soon fell in darkness and dead silence all around. I got frankly a bit scared to be home. To my mind, it would feel better to wait outside till my parents or grandparents come back. But my little brother didn't want to go out, that it was too cold. I had to lure him with the promise of buying him a sweets, and I ended up riding my bicycle for 20 minutes with my brother on the back to get to the supermarket in town. When we got out of the shop with candy bars in our mouth, it seemed still too early for my parents to be back home, so we headed to the game arcade. My parents usually banned us to go there, and, a forbidden fruit tends to be sweeter. We had too much fun to check time, and only when all my money was spent, I realized it was well past 9. I hurried back home again with my brother on the back. About half the way, lights from the village came into my sight. Hoping to cut the journey time, I took the unfamiliar dirt path through the farming field. In the middle of the bumpy road, I saw another bicycle coming from the opposite direction, but I was so much concentrated on getting back home as soon as possible that I didn't pay much attention. When we closed in too few meters distance, The other bike rang the bell. The dirt way was not wide enough for 2 bikes to pass by. I expected the other rider to be a village adult because there was no way another child should be out and about at this time of the day. So we got off our bicycle and made a way for the other bike to pass. The bike that passed in a leisurely pace was the typical old, heavy, big and clunky bicycle, but on it was a surprisingly small middle-aged lady. It was too dark to see who that was, but we just bowed, assuming that she should be one of our neighbors. She didn't respond and just rode on, disappearing into the darkness with its clunking noise. When I opened my mouth to tell my brother to hop on quickly, I tasted bitter in my mouth, as if I had licked a soap. It wasn't just me. Little brother also complained, and we both had to spit out. Anyway, we managed to get back home. Grandpa, who was having a smoke in the yard, saw us, but to my relief, he didn't scold us much. Granny and Grandpa also just got back home and were about to have unusually late dinner, so we just joined in. At the dinner table, I mentioned about the lady on bicycle we ran into. Grandpa didn't pay much attention at first, but when I talked about how we tasted something bitter after the encounter, he suddenly lost his temper. He was always gentle to us, but for that one occasion, he spanked me really hard until my dad, upon coming back home, stopped him. Grandpa took Dad to one side and seemed to tell him something. Dad then came to us, slapped lightly on the back of our heads, saying, "So why were you out and about so late? Now, go to bed." It was a long day, and we fell asleep quickly, but the day wasn't over yet. We were woken up by Granny in the middle of the night. She took us out to the yard and told us to strip naked. Little brother complained that it was too cold, but she wouldn't have it. When we got naked, she showered us with sea salt, a whole bowl full of salt. She then told us to rub the salt on our feet too. It was all very weird, but nobody explained what it was all about. That is, until recently. By now my family has moved to a bigger town, the old village was redeveloped, and both my grandparents passed away. One evening Mom and I took a look at an old photos from my childhood, and I remembered that weird night. When I asked about it, Mom lowered her voice and told me what it was about, on the one condition that I should not tell it to my brother, the delicate thing. Shortly after my parents got married, a married lady in the neighborhood had an affair with a widower in town who ran a shop that sold seeds, herbicide, and other farming stuffs. Her husband eventually found it out and beat his wife mercilessly out on their orchard until other villagers stepped in. The adulteress ran away in that tattered state and disappeared, only to be found a week later, dead. It was in a communal storage for the villagers, and the police said she seemed to have drunk down a bottle of herbicide on the day she disappeared. Her husband didn't even attend the funeral, and Sue moved away from the village. And then a rumor started going around the neighborhood that they ran into the dead woman at night on the dirt road to the town. First few accounts were brushed off as an alcohol-induced hallucinations, but soon more and more people claimed that they too saw her, and it became a taboo to use that route at late hours. And that way the rumor died down for a few years until I and my brother ran into her again. While we were sleeping that night, Grandma sought a Buddhist monk for an advice, and later gave us the salt shower as was instructed by him. As for that bitter taste in our mouth, my grandpa didn't see the ghost himself, but one of his friends did. And according to his account, he gasped with a shock when he saw the dead woman passing by, and he too tasted bitter. And the taste reminded him of that of herbicide that he occasionally got to taste as he sprayed over his farming field. I'm a bit apprehensive to talk about this, but this is probably the only time I was close to what could be spooky and paranormal, so here we go. When I was young, my uncle lived near the popular mountain trail for hikers. At the beginning of the trail was a restaurant in the forest run by a woman, a mother of two. I called her ma'am then, but in truth she was in her early 30s and still a young woman. Her daughter was about my age, so we became playmates, and my uncle often babysat for us because her mother was very busy running the restaurant business. Then, since when, a man who looked about the similar age as the restaurant owner came to visit, drunk and looking to make trouble. I had never seen somebody so drunk and violent, and I ran to my uncle terrified. When Uncle ran to the restaurant, we could hear the scream of the restaurant owner and cries of her kids. The drunk man was shaking her about by her hair. Turned out the drunken man was the husband and the father of the kids. He was an alcoholic with a mean, violent streak and would come to his wife's business always asking for more money. At the time, the authority didn't take domestic violence seriously, and there was hardly any punishment to the offenders. My uncle and his wife tried to step in whenever they could, but being no relation to the restaurant owner, there was only so much they could do. And then, for some family issue, my uncle moved to another town, and with that, I also lost contact to my playmate and her mother. It was about 2 years later when we happened to go back to the area, and the restaurant was in ruins. It was all charred black and trashed. My uncle knew something terrible had taken place and asked around his old neighbors. Apparently, not quite a month after my uncle moved away, the violent husband came over once again one late evening. He first stabbed the restaurant owner and then locked his kids and the restaurant staff in and set fire. It triggered a gas canister to explode, killing the restaurant owner and her daughter on the spot. Her son and the staff too later died in the hospital due to severe burn. But the tragedy wasn't over. Nobody wanted to touch the burned-down restaurant, and the rumor went around that people saw strange apparitions in that ruin. Some hikers reported that they went there thinking it was opened for business, and suddenly realized that it was a burnt-down ruin. Or a homeless man tried to spend a night there only to suffer a scary nightmare of a woman, charred black and strangling him, screaming, "Get out!" By then, locals didn't even dare to mention about the cursed place. It was a horrible memory for me too, and didn't think about it for many years. Until recently, when I saw a YouTube video of a vlogger and a shaman visiting allegedly haunted spots. My heart dropped when I realized they were visiting the familiar spot, the old restaurant. Apparently, the strange apparition continues there, and by now, it has won internet notoriety. It's more than 10 years ago now, and I have become an adult. It breaks my heart to think the souls of 5- and 3-year-olds might be still around there. And their mother, the poor lady who used to give me a white peppermint candy. After the military service, I worked part-time at a beer hall for a while. It was just 10 minutes walk from my home, so couldn't be better. One little issue of bang in the middle of the residential area was sometimes underage teens coming to drink feigning to be adults, the bolder ones among them even daring to show fake ID. One evening, a group of clearly underage-looking boys came to the beer hall. I asked for their ID and they had carefully scratched out their birth year, 1988 to 1986. But it couldn't fool me. I asked them to live, and they did, swearing at me under their breath. About an hour passed. I saw red and blue lights flashing from the outside. It was a police car. I sneaked out, expecting something exciting, and well, it was that same group of kids taken into the police car. I found a part-timer from our neighboring beer hall watching the same scene, all nerves and anxious. I asked him what happened. Apparently the kids, after kicked out by me, tried their luck at the beer hall next door. And luck they had. They got away with their fake ID and shared 6 bottles of soju among 4 of them. Got drunk and bold, they loudly bragged about how they got away with their fake ID, they should come back there with their even younger girlfriends, and so on. The part-timer and the owner only then realized they sold alcohol to the underage kids, but under the current Youth Protection Act, they had a lot more to lose if the authority were to be involved. They just hoped the kids to shut up and go. But alas, a customer overheard what the kids were saying and reported it to the police. The part-timer guy sighed and worried about his employer that he'd been having enough trouble in hand already, even without such a blow. On the other hand, my employer praised me for having caught and kicked the kids out, and he gave me some extra payment. Our neighbor was definitely not as lucky. His bar was ordered to be closed down for 3 months for having sold alcohol to underage kids. My employer worried for his neighbor, that his father had just passed away recently and his mother was in hospital for stroke too. As his staff mentioned, he seemed to have had his hand already full. The neighboring bar kept closed all the while, and just a paper of executive order for closing was getting yellow on the rolled-down shutter. One day, while I was unpeeling onions in the kitchen, somebody called out from the floor. There was a middle-aged woman.
"Could I talk to your boss? I'd like to ask if he'd seen my husband recently. He's the owner of the bar next door."
Her voice was trembling, and her eyes were already wet. My boss came in not long after and recognized her.
"What is up? What are you doing here?" he asked.
"My husband went out a week ago and is gone missing ever since. His phone is kept off too. I searched around and even went to his father's tomb, but can't find him. Might you have any idea?"
she said. Her teary eyes turned to full-blown crying now. When she calmed down a bit, my boss cautiously said,
"He might be in his bar. Have you checked there yet?"
"What would he do in an empty bar?"
she said.
"Well, it doesn't hurt to check since you are here anyway. Let's go together,
my boss said. Meanwhile, I went back to my job in the kitchen, but not long after, the woman's shrill scream I could clearly hear even from there. I went out and saw my boss jumping in, and with a humid early summer air from outside, could I detect the whiff of disgusting smell, a mixture of sewer and rotting fish? Boss waved at me with a pale face.
Quick! Call the emergency!
After the terrible commotion with an ambulance, police, crowd, and screams, Boss came back in. He sat at one corner with a visibly pale face a while and told me to wrap up for the day and to have a drink with him instead.
Our neighbor. As I told you, he lost his father and his mother is gravely ill. The business wasn't very good on top of it all, and he seemed to have made not a small debt, even from some loan sharks. The 3 months closure order might have been the last straw for him. There was his will next to him that the insurance payout should be enough to pay back the debt,
my boss said. 2 months passed. The neighboring bar was all stripped out for new refurbishment down to bare pillars. And strange things started happening around the time at my workplace. When a customer called for service at my beer hall, somebody replied, "I'll be right there," before I did. Or when clearly underage kids tried to trick me with a fake ID, the front door rattled as if somebody was trying to open it. And sometimes, as I finished cleaning up at the end of the day and turning the lights off, I saw a faint shadow of a man, weeping with his face buried in his arms. All I could do was to say quietly in my mind, hoping that he could hear me, "Here's not your bar, poor man." I stopped working there when I returned to university. When I returned there a few months later, I found it out of business too. I guess that was bound to happen. Hi, it's Anthony here, and thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed today's stories, though they were all a bit sad. Their unfortunate background stories were sad in themselves, but to think their souls are stuck and relive the tragic situation over and over is even worse. But I'm trying to collect a bit brighter and heartwarming stories for next week to finish this year on more positive note. Well, as positive as ghost stories could get. So, stay tuned. If you enjoyed my work, please give it a like and a comment, and please consider subscribing to my channel. It's all free, but help a small content creator like me a lot. If you'd support me more directly, I also have a Buy Me a Coffee account. The link's in the description. Buy Me a Coffee supporters are getting an early access to my new videos. Thank you. Hope you're all keeping warm, unless you live in the Southern Hemisphere. Until next, stay safe and take care.